A big question that I get is, how did I become an artist? And generally I think what people are asking me is, how do I become an artist, or how do I become a photographer, or how do I get into the industry? And generally what I tell people is, the answer that they're looking for a shortcut, but the answer is you need to look within. And that's something that I do all the time. So if you have seen a talk of mine before, you'll know that I always start in the beginning and I drag you back to my childhood. So here we go. Who am I? I was born in 1976, and it was the age of fantasy. Everything in film was epic, and it was set design, huge props, lots of kind of outrageous characters acting very poorly, and we all loved it very much. I was a very big Darth Vader fan, and I actually had a slide that started with to give you the vibe, and then I was like, that's tacky, but I decided to throw it in personally for you then. And you know, Gremlins and all of that. And what they all have in common is that it's all set design, which I love, and it really, really inspired the way that I work today. My muse, David, my brother, was born when I was 4, and I talk about David because he was the first person who really let me dress him up and fuck around and, you know, have lots of fun. So here he is, being such a good boy, and after a while I realised I could really get into costume design, and he really, really went with it, you know. A total legend. And then I started thinking, I should really teach him how to, you know, take on the character. He's in the middle there. He's really being a convict. Dirtied up his costume for him. He doesn't have just white bed sheets on, and really getting into the vibe of it all. And so that was great for me. And from a really young age, I wanted to do ballet, probably because it was all about dressing up and role play. And it hugely influenced the way that I work today. A lot of the people I work with are dancers because they can totally take on that character in the way that I need my characters to do. My parents really encouraged it, and one, they put the money into having me trained as a dancer, so that was great. And two, they took me to performances where if the Russian ballet were in town, they would take me along, and that's a really privileged thing. I didn't come from a wealthy family, but they really, you know, acknowledged that passion within me and did that. And that was where I was introduced to a totally different world to the ballet that I was learning. I was learning, you know, I would have a ballet teacher who would sit us down and say, listen to this piece of music, imagine this scene unfolding, and describe essentially what is a danced play that we would all be characters in. And then we would do it, and it would all be a bit tacky, and that was the 80s and that was ballet. But when I went to see these performances, I got to see a whole new world of set design. And when you see my work, you'll see that my work is set design. And that came from here. I also started to realise that it wasn't just about the person who was on stage in the middle of it all. It was about all of the layers that go into a stage. And they're all beautiful painted artworks that are layered. So it's not by too much coincidence that I became a digital artist working in layers. You were supposed to play. And yeah, and here's a good example of how a stage would look. And when you're standing behind a stage, not this one, it's a little bit boring, really, if we look at that. And as a dancer, when you're waiting in the wings to go on, you start to realise that all of these elements have a really important role to play, and that as the curtain closes and then reopens, the whole world has changed again, and it invites that person in the audience to just get swept into that world. And that's something that I really aim to do with my work. My parents had absolutely no filter. They took me to see Porky's and all sorts of rotten stuff when I was a kid. And you're not the PC parents that we have today. So when I was 8, they took me off to see Amadeus, and that had a huge impact on me. Now, you probably shouldn't take an 8-year-old to see someone slicing their throat open, but for me it was the music and the drama and the fact that things weren't about being pretty anymore, they were about being convincing and dramatic, and that really impacted me. So when I was 18, I went to art school, and I went to a traditional art school called the National Art School in Sydney, and for a teenager who felt like rebelling at 18, it was almost like going to prison. And actually, it's at Sydney jail. So I spent 3 years at jail learning painting and sculpture and printmaking and drawing and photography. If you failed drawing, you failed everything. That was just their structure. And it meant that I had to become good at drawing, and I really didn't want to do drawing, but I became good at drawing. And you see in my own work that it is highly illustrative, and that's because it became a really useful tool for me. So people often ask me about what to do to become good at Photoshop, for instance, and I say go and do life drawing classes, because it teaches you to look at how light is falling on a subject and how you can move things around that subject and to form the thing you want to form. This is the campus, and it was filled with these teachers who, the majority of them were teaching modern art. It was all very cool. It was really shitty to me. I just did not relate to it whatsoever because I had this classical background. So in this cylindrical building in the centre, which had been a chapel, and this was a site where people were, I think there were 80 people executed on this site. It was a very haunting place to be, but it was also an extraordinary place to study art. And I would go inside this chapel, and it was filled with the most extraordinary books. And the thing about libraries and that time in my life was there was no internet. The internet, the majority of the internet is just filled with shit. And you go on there and you just have to scrape through it to find the really great content. And it's also overwhelming because there is lots of great content throughout the entire globe. But at that time, you essentially had librarians who were curating a selection of books for you. And for me, that meant that I got to discover things that I might not have been swept up in had I just looked up photography on the internet. My inspirations became painting. One of the first artists to really sweep me up was Botticelli, because Botticelli wove a narrative into his work. And why is that important to me? Well, because I'm a storyteller in my work. Back on the stage when we were dancing, we were telling stories. When I was watching films, we were watching stories. And so it was the first time I started to think, so I don't have to just photograph what's literally in front of me, I can make things up. And isn't that wonderful? But I couldn't paint very well. So I couldn't actually sit down and paint this way because I wanted to do photorealism like this. So that's why photography became my tool, but I don't photograph the world around me, I create the world around me. The next was Caravaggio, and Caravaggio is the most famous artist for chiaroscuro, the play of light and dark. The play of light and dark is about using one main light source, and anything that is not captured in that light source just drops out and becomes irrelevant, and it becomes dead space. And in the commercial world, you'll never see dead space, and I've been on commercial shoots where people say, oh no, you have to light that area because you can't have dead space. For me, dead space is the most relevant thing to making an artwork in my style, because I am making the things that are important to me really relevant to you, and everything else can just disappear into the darkness. And so here they are. Of course, they're very beautifully painted as well. The Pre-Raphaelites became the next thing for me because I was a teenager and I had an awful boyfriend and he was a shit and I just felt very emotional And so the Pre-Raphaelites are all about love and death. And that's a teenager's thing, isn't it? So, we have some beautiful death here, and a little bit more beautiful death here. And, but the thing is, it's also about the light, and really, these were painters who were painting at a time when photography had just been invented. But photography was not as clear then as their paintings, because they were extraordinary at what they did. So for me, looking at the way that they used clothing and manipulated the clothing to have beautiful folds throughout them, that became something that I started to introduce into my own work. And of course, breasts. There are plenty of breasts in my work. So, still life painting, that became another big thing. Let me see the time, because I've got to go through at a certain speed. Okay, good. It's not about pretty flowers for me. I want to see the undoing of beauty in my work. I don't go along and pick just very pretty models. I want someone who's sort of unusual looking, or I don't retouch every single wrinkle out of people. I often introduce flaws into people because I don't want them to feel artificial. So for me, a still life painting of flowers is not about the beauty of the overall image. It's about all the little nitty-gritty bits and the petals that are falling off and the spiders and the cycle of life that you see in real life. And symbolism became a big thing for me. So I started looking at historical paintings and how a painter, for instance, may look at a sitter who's not wearing any pearls in her hair. Botticelli, for the first time ever in art history, started to paint things that actually weren't in front of him. And he started to introduce these things that turned women into goddesses. And that really appealed to me. And certainly that's what introduced me to the idea of going into post-production. Photoshop was very new when I began in Photoshop. And so that's why I headed that direction. So after all of this is what I started to focus on. I'd found my muse, which was hyper-real painting, despite being a photographer, and the tableau. The tableau is a story that is unfolding within the one frame. And here we go. So this is some very early work that I shot back then. That's me getting hypothermia in the water, pretending I'm dying. And this is someone else dying, moving into medium format photography. We were all cross-processing then. We were shooting on slide and using negative chemistry so that you got these really hyper colours. You never really knew what you were going to get. You never knew what you were shooting, but that's what was exciting about it. And I kind of missed that as well. After that, I dumped the dude and I started to feel quite empowered. And my 20s were about finding myself and finding the goddess in women. And I started to look a lot at fashion design. And I'm not someone who's interested in fast fashion or fast food. I make slow art. I'm inspired by designers who do couture collections that are artistic pieces. So I'm also interested in the theatre of fashion. So I was really looking a lot at catwalks and, or what do they call them now? Runway shows. And the fact that the fashion almost became secondary to the overall effect of it all. It was a theatre that they were putting on, and the symbolism and the drama and the stage all really became very, very relevant to that period of fashion. Yeah, so that stuff really turned me on, and these were the kinds of things that were coming out and being displayed when I was working on my master's series by this point. My master's series was about historical figures, but I wasn't interested in making portraits that emulated those historical figures or looked like the paintings of that period. They had to be contemporary and appeal to contemporary audiences. And I noticed that these fashion designers were doing similar things. They would look at historical themes, but then they would own it and turn it into something that was really relevant and edgy and contemporary. And so while they were doing that, I was releasing my master's series, and in a way I was a little bit ahead in releasing them, and it meant that I got kind of caught up in their wave because they're huge and I was nobody, and it meant that my work just suddenly appeared everywhere on the internet. I'd never been able to get even in a newspaper at that stage. So I was very fortunate that they were topical and would appear alongside these really big designers, which meant I would get contacted by companies like Givenchy to get involved in things. And so for the first time, I started to feel like I had a bit of a voice in the industry. Marie Antoinette is probably what I'm most known for, and she was in the Archibald when they had a photographic section. And the whole series was about working in the digital space in Photoshop, and to push the pixels as far as I could to photograph everything completely separately. I had a scholarship, a travelling scholarship, which allowed me to travel around with 100 rolls of medium format film and a camera and capture all of these backgrounds and then come back to Australia and try to turn it into something. And this is what I came up with. I'm going to whiz through these. Inspiration today is generally film, but it's not film that is capturing real life. It's cinematographers who work in a theatrical way. So they're making artworks, or they're making films that look like artworks, I should say, that look like stages. I see something like that, and I'm like, oh my God, have you seen this film? It's so amazing, and there's all these layers, and that's how I see photography. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 projects. I'm watching the time because I can ramble on, so maybe someone remind me if I'm going a little bit too over the top. Between the Regal 12 and the next few bodies of work, there was a lot of work in between. I think you've probably heard me talk about them before. In 2014, we had a very young baby, and we decided to move to the Southern Highlands because I was living in a very tiny apartment in Sydney, and I had a gigantic Epson printer in the lounge room, and Heidi's bedroom was filled with computers and boxes and all that crap. And when we moved to the Southern Highlands, it was to produce a series called Rococo. And when I arrived there, I received an invitation from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to get involved with a project called The Art of Saving a Life. And what they did is they said, there's very little money, of course, because we're a charity. But it was actually a cause that was very close to my heart. And they were inviting 40 artists from around the world, and people were like Mia Farrow and Annie Leibovitz and all these really big names. And I thought, I really should put some time into this thing. And they were going to these artists and saying, here's a really important medical issue that we would like you to highlight in some respect. But we haven't got an art director, and we haven't got a brief for you. So we would like to say to you, you're doing smallpox, and come to us with a concept for a shoot, or for a painting, or whatever it might be. And so I quickly jumped online and went, what's smallpox really look like? And if you do that, it's quite a sickening experience. It essentially is something that ravishes your body in a very small space of time, and you are covered in pustules, and then you die. And in history, 500 million people have died from smallpox. It's a disease that does not just affect the poor, it affects absolutely everybody. And it's the very first disease that was completely eliminated from the planet through vaccination. So it was a really big, important disease to get given. But I had to think about ways to produce an artwork on it that wouldn't revolt people, because their aim was to release all 40 artworks overnight, and hopefully the media around the world picks them up and writes stories that are relevant on it. So it was kind of a hook to get stories out there about the importance of vaccinations in third world countries. It also, the aim was to have an exhibition at the end of it with all 40 artists in Germany, where they were having a big convention to raise money for the research of vaccinations. So I put together a brief on smallpox. I'm going to quickly go through it. I did a quick sketch. I do sketches because I'm communicating with a lot of people about what my intentions are, and I'm trying to remember what my intentions are as I'm making them. The reason there's a cow bombing up the back there is because smallpox, the way they came up with a vaccination was that Dr. Edward Jenner, who they also wanted included in it, was in the pub one night, and he overheard these two girls saying that they were milkmaids and that they had been milking cows and they had got cowpox. But as a consequence, none of these women ever caught smallpox. And it occurred to him that if you give someone a very small amount of something, maybe they don't get the big thing. And that's how vaccinations came about. So there was to be a cow in it, and there was to be Dr. Edward Jenner, the young boy that he inoculated, and also a figure in the centre who represented both smallpox, because she would be covered in smallpox in some way, and she would be aristocratic looking, because I wanted to show that this is not a problem that is just third world. This is something that you need to think about in first world countries, because we often think, well, we're kind of safe, but we're really not. Believe me, I've just been sick for 2 years in London. I also, because they said there was very little budget, I had to start thinking about what I was going to make and what all the things were, the materials that I needed, and who I needed to approach for sponsorship, because there's a lot of money to put together a shoot like this. And so I start sketching these things. I need acrylic paints because I'm going to do ornate panelled backgrounds. I'm going to build a doctor's surgery. I don't want it to look like anything that's real. I want it to look unusual. What kind of techniques I'm going to use for painting. I got sponsorship for paintbrushes, paints, oil paints, all of these things. I wanted to have a cow painting in there. Canvas. It was going to look like this. And I'm essentially asking this client to trust my vision and to not micromanage me by getting them to sign off on this. This was some period costuming of the actual doctor in paintings of that period, so that I could get the vibe in my own head of what it would look like. But for the central figure, I wanted something unusual, because I did have to do something that was beautiful as well, or it just wouldn't get printed. So I started looking, researching, and I realized that the Chinese referred to smallpox back in the day as heavenly flowers, because as the pustules would appear on their body and burst into bloom, you would go to heaven. So I thought, well, flowers is a really nice motif for smallpox. So I'll focus on flowers, and then that can become a part of the story that they write about. And these are all the things that I needed to go after. So I began by sourcing 500 little tiny glass bottles that would look like medical bottles, and they would go in the background, and they would represent the 500 million people who had died from smallpox. And on each bottle, I wanted them to look like those little old medical bottles that you see in photographs and things. And I had a skull and flowers to represent life and death. And I did that by photographing a skull in the studio, and I shot it against black, and I shot it against whites, and I just wanted to really experiment and see what I could do. And then these are the bottles once they're finished. I printed out all of the artworks onto little labels, cut them, you know, scrubbed them, painted them. This is the costuming that I came up with, because I do all my own costuming and set design, all of that stuff, and I do that because it's a pleasure to me to do that stuff. And it's challenging, and we need challenges. Here's the video from that.
I was approached by the Gates Foundation to produce an artwork on Dr. EUGENE and the history of smallpox. Jenner's work in pioneering the vaccine led to it being the only disease that's been completely eradicated from the planet. I'm Alexia Sinclair and I'm an artist, and I'm best known for my photomedia work. I really like this artwork to help start a discussion about the importance of vaccines. On the surface, the artwork is set in an 18th century style doctor surgery. There is the Dr. EUGENE and the young boy who plays a big role in the finding of an inoculation for smallpox. The Chinese referred to smallpox as heavenly flowers, and the flowers are dispersed throughout the artwork and represent its global impact. The idea behind the skull and the flowers also is that it really represents the light and dark and the life and death and the ephemeral nature of life in general. I joined this project because disease is something I believe we all need to fight together, because ultimately we all share the same planet.
And when I made it, it wasn't completely out of sync like that. So anyway, you get the point. So here's the final piece, and you get a sense of that from you know, the mood boards that I presented initially to the client. And this artwork appeared in 80 newspapers overnight, and which was a really amazing experience, and it all ended up at the Garvey Convention, and the world leaders donated $7.5 billion towards the project. So that's really good. And that all worked. And from 2015 to now, I've been jumping in and out of a series called Into the Gloaming. Into the Gloaming is a fantasy series, and I tend to do historical work. But I think because I had a child, I was reading all of these fairy tale books, and it sort of inspired me to do a little bit of fantasy. We were also starting to play a lot with video, and it was a chance to do cool video work. So it is ongoing, and you'll see more work appearing, but here's a little bit of it. The first artwork was called Into the Gloaming as well. So it's fair to say that that everything bar the moths in that was shot in camera. So I had gone from being someone who was working heavily in post-production and really enjoying the challenges of layering in post-production, but now I was layering in the studio space. It began by looking at, actually I found this amazing book which had a castle coming out of it, and I thought, well, that would be really cool to do, and I love the idea of having a central figure who is the storyteller, and she has a book where the fairy tales are sort of exploding from the book. And that idea of building a set where all of the components come together to form it in camera. And I always sketch my costuming beforehand because it's something that I'm not formally trained in costume design, so I actually have to figure out how I'm going to make it. And it was a time when also I was really excited about printing and pushing the boundaries of what you could do with these big, large format printers that we have now. And so I got my hands on some wallpaper that I could print, and I found a painting that I mirrored, and we printed the back panels onto wallpaper, and it became the background sort of forest for it. And we had to, well, we built these sort of panels that looked like books in the background that were on the walls, so it's like a little library that she's got her book from. And then we had to sort of warp the printed background over that in real life. And that was cool. If you ever want to try that, that was fun to do. Also, the costuming, I wanted to make my own fabric for it. And so we went and got ivy and lilies and put them onto black velvet in the studio and then shot them from above. And then we printed it onto Belgian linen and then started to form the dress from that digitally printed fabric. And then we went off and got all of the plants and brought them into the studio and layered the real things over the top. So I was really kind of blurring the idea between what is a printed medium and what is real. The Awakening of Flora I've recently released, and Flora is a very famous mythological goddess. She's just appeared in pretty much everything that's inspired me over the years, so she found her way into the series. And here she is, and she shot on site up in the Southern Highlands. This young girl's grandmother has amazing gardens which have these very formal hedges that we shot in. And everything again is shot in camera other than the giant flower that's on her head. Kissed by the Moon was the second one that I produced for the series, and it was the idea that it went from the storybook and the central storyteller to the Queen of the Fairies from Midsummer Night's Dream, Titania. So I started looking at A Midsummer Night's Dream, and here's the video for that. So the way that we produced this was obviously she's shot on location, and my hair artist is this extraordinary person who can produce these flying hairdos using guttering and nails and things, and just nail them straight to the head. No, it's intense. There's a lot of Nurofen involved. And then the moth wings were, I got a macro lens and I photographed a moth, and then I blew it right up and I did the printing again onto the Belgian linen, and so that's moth wings at the back of her, and slavishly kind of did all this silly sewing. The reason I do all of that sewing work is you can do the time in post-production or you can do it in pre-production. It doesn't matter, you've got to spend the time either way. And so, because I'd already challenged myself with all of the digital work, I really enjoyed just trying new things all the time. And so that's why there's all this heavy costuming at this point in my life. Night of the Swan is recent as well. And it was about an Arthurian figure who had gone across the water on a swan-drawn boat and had rescued a damsel in distress. And it's kind of interesting because this swan makes its way into even the Prince of Wales's badge in the Renaissance times was this swan, because everybody swore that they were from the bloodline of this guy who had these swans that took him across the river. It's kind of funny, but people used to believe legends like that. So it's interesting to bring that sort of thing into a fairy tale. I photographed her in my studio, and the swan is in Hyde Park in London, and the chains and things are on my grounds, and so there is composite work in this one. Whispers in the Woods is the final piece in this series, and at the time that I was in the Southern Highlands, the closest forest was the forest, that Belanglo forest, where Ivan Milat was going around stabbing people, and it was a very haunting place to go to, but it was what was available, and it was very beautiful. So we would visit there and go mushroom hunting, actually, and I started thinking about the tales of Little Red Riding Hood, and I started thinking about the Romanovs, the Russian royal family who had been taken into forests and executed, and they'd never found Anastasia. And so this one's not really a particular person, but it's kind of inspired by the idea of these haunted forests. So this is the final piece. Rococo is the series that I moved to the Southern Highlands to produce while I'm doing all these other things, and I had been reading about a certain character that I'll talk about in a second, and she really inspired me to take on this series. Because I was living in this tiny little apartment, we decided to move to an acre of land, and the idea was to just build gardens and grow thousands of flowers there to build the next series. Looking at the Rococo period, which is 18th century France and England, but mostly France, it was a really, really cheeky period. And I'm a pretty cheeky person. I probably am a little bit nervous and don't seem it, but I am a very cheeky person. And so I really wanted to do something cheeky. As you can see from their paintings of that period, they're very cheeky. And I wanted to bring my daughter up in a really beautiful environment as well. So that's why I moved to London. No, I'm home. So during that time, while the gardens were growing, I was inside madly sewing on the machine and getting all the costumes ready. And we were working together, the flowers and I, to get to spring. That was the aim. So these are all the gardens. We're catching butterflies and insects and stuff to bring into the scene. The reason that I shot them in a studio setting instead of out in the meadows, there's several reasons, but the main one is that if you actually look down into the flowers in a meadow, they're very sparse in reality, and there's holes in them, and there's dirt, and they're not actually, they're beautiful from a distance, but they're not beautiful from above. And the concept was that I would build these 4-meter square backgrounds that were, essentially they were still lives. I was going back to my still lives. And I would completely fill them with all of the flowers, and they would be really rich and lush, and they needed to be something extraordinary. So that's the idea behind growing the flowers and bringing exotics in from flower markets and that sort of thing. And it was a nice, sharp photo for you. It's a video. It was actually a wonderful experience to have with our daughter to grow there. So it was a real pleasure. The whole thing was a real pleasure. I shouldn't have moved from the Southern Highlands. The reason it began was Madame de Pompadour. So I had been reading about Madame de Pompadour, who was mistress to the King of France. She was an extraordinarily intelligent woman, and I liked that. And she absolutely loved flowers. And she, through her love of flowers, encouraged the whole of France to embrace flowers as well. She had commissioned ceramics companies to produce thousands of porcelain flowers for her to have placed throughout Versailles, the Palace of Versailles. And because she was the mistress, she got whatever she wanted, and there they were, and the servants would have to go around dousing the flowers with perfume every day so that they seemed real. I thought, that's just crazy, I love that, and I really want to do something with that. So my plan was, and this is the first one in the series, to get not porcelain flowers, because I'm not loaded, but to get silk flowers or artificial flowers and to soak them in paint. I couldn't spray paint them because they just didn't sort of fill correctly. So I would dip them in paint and hang them up and let the paint drip off them and make them look like they were porcelain flowers. Of course, they had to be double dipped. And of course, there's thousands of mosquitoes in the Southern Highlands. So in amongst them, you see lots of squashed mosquitoes and things. And that's where post-production comes in. And also the books make their way in there to show that she was an avid reader. And this is a test print. It's very three-dimensional. Marie Antoinette was a massive historical figure at that time who was really the most fashionable woman in the whole world. And her life was filled with scandal. And I've just been going back to her again and again because she was just so extravagant and wore the most ridiculous things. And there was one of the big scandals was the affair of the diamond necklace, where she actually didn't commission this necklace. It was one of the only things that she didn't commission. But ultimately she got the blame for it, and it led to her downfall. So I had her necklace recreated from a company in the UK and then shipped it out, and then here we have the model wearing it in the shoot. To describe what we're doing is the camera is hoisted 24 feet above the model, and then there's tubs of water and then the flowers that are all hastily put in there. And sorry, my bra just keeps dropping off. And then the flowers are all propped up, and then she walks in. We've got pellet cases in the middle, and she sort of walks along the plank, and then we put some pillows down, and then she lies it, and then she tries to look comfortable for the camera that's up above. She was also known to be a lesbian, and really copped a lot for it, and so here she is in a nice little naughty pose. It's very much like the Rococo period. Duchess of Devonshire was an English character at that time who was really renowned for ostrich feathers and gambling. So all of these characters sort of wind their way into the series. Madame du Barry was another of the king's mistresses. He had about 59 or something, and she was really opulent and probably a little bit silly. And so here's the really opulent one. For this, I had this silk made in China that had peonies embroidered all over it, and shipped it out. And then I had this great body paint artist that I often work with replicate the paintwork across her chest. And here they are. So, and you're having to work really quickly too, because of course the flowers all wilt very quickly. So you pretty much have about 5 minutes once they're in there. They're in hair and makeup for 59 hours, and then they come in and I've got 5 minutes to make it happen. So wrangling creatures is, I really like to not buy stock and to try to do, the challenge is to just shoot everything I possibly can myself. So if you see a lion in my work, you know that I've been in a cage and I've photographed the lion and the deer and the swan, and that's why they're in the work, is because I'm going out and freezing my bum off photographing butting deer. But of course I love the detail, so let's not forget the little guys. I am a wrangler of birds, and my daughter would say, why are you putting a feast of, watermelon and stuff set up with lights in the garden? Because you have to entice them in. A wrangler of ants, a wrangler of spiders, a wrangler of snails, caterpillars. But the thing for me is I want my work to be enjoyed as a whole, but I really want people to go in and explore all the detail. And when they own my work, I want them to, people write to me and they're like, I just discovered the this and the blah, and that's what I really love. So the series has still lives in them as well, and those little details are there to be explored. It resulted in an exhibition that I had in Sydney and at Black Eye Gallery. And also I had the costumes and props and things in there because people don't really believe that they're real and that they're photographed that way and that you can just Photoshop it, which actually is a great challenge in itself, and I hate that people belittle Photoshop. But both are hard and they're both visible. I won't play this because I'm getting out of time. So while the exhibition was happening, I was building the next set of flowers. And this is the next shoot from the next spring. I'll show this video quickly because it's only a minute. Yeah. Dan, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And that really sort of explains how the series is put together. I'm getting warned that I'm running out of time. But yeah, this is actually twins. This is not someone who's mirrored. And we literally did have a couple minutes to get their poses identical and everything. So that was kind of a challenging one because the body painting took all day to do all of that. And here I'll just whiz, whiz, whiz. They're square. I've obviously cropped into everything too because I want you to see the detail. All right, that resulted in an exhibition in London. My idea with London was I wanted to go there. I wanted to have an exhibition there. I wanted to be in the Portrait Prize. There were these things I wanted to tick off before my daughter started school in Australia because actually I was incredibly homesick the entire time I was there. But here I am. She starts school in January. But I did my exhibition, and that was great. And finally, I wanted to mention the Palace of Dreams, which I... back in 2015, when I was doing the Rococo series, Phase 1 approached me and said, top secret, we're about to release this new world-first 100 megapixel camera. If you just happen to be working on something, we like to use it in the campaign. And I didn't happen to be working on anything that was appropriate for it. But I was thinking about a series that 2 years later I'm now starting to make. But at that time, I did the first one, and I recently did a Kickstarter for that artwork, revamped so that because I had time to do it the way I wanted to. And so this little clip is the time lapse of the photo shoot from that first artwork. And it was at this time that I realised that videos were taking over and the craft that I loved was not getting the attention that I wanted. And I was starting to feel very, not pressured by brands, but pressured just by expectations of everyone wanting behind-the-scenes stuff all the time. And really that was driving everything, and I needed to step away from it all to make everything quiet again. Because, for instance, that video that's 30 seconds long was a time lapse that ran for 2 full days. And the photo shoot that I would probably ordinarily put together in half a day had to shoot over 2.5 days or 2 days because we needed to get that, you know, amazing sort of pulling out thing on the dolly. So it was amazing to do, but it's a change of direction for me. And just to quickly break down the artwork, because I have 4 minutes, it demonstrates what's coming next, which is that I'm doing a series of historical women. Again, hello, hey, cliche. And it looks at the codes that those women use to make them immediately identifiable. You see all the time in contemporary fashion houses like Chanel where they have codes where you say, okay, it's Chanel because she has a boda, she has the camellia, she has a black bow. I know that that's Chanel, she's got the look. And all of these historical figures, when we look at royals today, they all have a look. And my job in this series is to pull that look apart, figure out what it is that makes them iconic, and then reconstruct it in an interesting way. So the artwork was based on Elizabeth I, who was the Virgin Queen. When you start to look at her, she's really interesting. No one ever got to paint her from life because she was just a mere frail woman. And she wanted to appear to be very strong in a time when women really weren't allowed to have any power. So any painter was given a sort of a stencil and told this is what she has to look like, no matter how old she is. So this is the aging face of Elizabeth over her many, many years of reigning. And if you didn't make her look pretty, you just off with the head. This is a good example of how, in this first picture, she is 40 years younger than this picture, but the only way you can tell that is by looking at the collar that she's wearing. They started off really small, then they got big, then they went big, you know, and so it's really interesting for me to look at fashion of that time and to work out what it is that makes someone identifiable. She's using symbols of monarchy in her art. She's using, and this is my first portrait on her, and I'm going that path of using the orb and the scepter, which is traditional for English monarchy. She's using symbols of piety to say, look, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm a good woman. She's got the rose because she's a Tudor and she's trying to identify with her father, who was a very powerful figure. Later on, she starts to use symbols of the empire, say, look, I'm the ruler of the world, my hand's on the globe, and that sort of thing. And symbols of chastity. So she would often have things like a phoenix in her costuming and in her paintings. You can see in the centre here that there's little phoenixes, and that resembles the idea of rebirth and purity. And it's something that I brought into the costuming. And then you can see contemporary fashion designers being sort of inspired by the same sort of looks, symbols of strength. You know, these are all propaganda tools that I'm really interested in my work. So here she is giving a speech to the troops, wearing her armour just before the famous Spanish Armada battle, and she won it because there was a really big storm, and so she was just kind of lucky because the Spaniards all drowned. But here she is, ferocious queen with her armour, and it was really important because it kept her alive for a really long time. And you see it today. The Queen doesn't really go around firing shotguns anymore, I don't think, but they still do it, and so I think it's relevant to contemporary audiences. And on they go. She was really weird. I mean, she had eyeballs, ears, and mouths sewn into her costuming to say, I have spies, I'm all-knowing. Watch yourselves. So she's interesting, you know, and the background of the artwork is about A Midsummer Night's Dream because she was the patroness of Shakespeare. And I really wanted to have this really gentle background that was in total contrast to the armour that she's wearing on her costuming, to show that she had to be a woman in a man's body. So the warrior, like, here she is, I've got a sword, I swing my sword around, I've got chest plate, armour, and these are the things that inspired my costuming. This is the me getting to work on the breastplate that I made for it. I wanted to be a bit Aussie, and I got kangaroo leather, and I drew I drew a phoenix and I mirrored it, and then, and this is not the way you meant to do it, because I don't know how you meant to do it, but I put the template down onto the leather, and then I drew it onto there, and then I cut it out by hand, and everyone said, why didn't you get it laser cut? Because I didn't really know about laser cutting. And then I decided I would bead it and I would make it really over the top, and this became her sort of contemporary armour. Of course, you know, her piety's coming. I'm an atheist, but for me it's like, well, that's a part of her personality, and the halo, and the armour. And I then photographed all of these little tiny objects that were a part of the shoot because I said, I should do a scarf because I've got no other pressure in my life. And so this key is this tiny little key that I was given for my 21st birthday by my grandmother. And it's extraordinary to see it that size. It's extraordinary how many little bits of shit are in it that you have to retouch out when you are enlarging something. And these components all became a part of this scarf that I made, where I took pieces out of the background that I'd printed, that was a famous painting, and then brought all these elements into it and made a scarf. And I was like, oh, they all used to carry these pomanders, which have a little orange with cloves, and they would sniff it and it would keep all the evil spirits away from them and keep them alive until smallpox got them. And so I included one of those. And that's the Palace of Dreams, a little video. Final piece. So I ended up bringing ivy into it and the little pomander, and it's ongoing. So the next 3 to 4 years is what I'll be spending on this series, and I'll be giving little bits away on Instagram, and I really hope you will join me and you will come on this journey with me and ultimately come to the exhibition with me. And thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me today and for coming.